Welcome to the Learning Cosmos podcast. I'm your host, André Hedlund, educational psychologist, author, geek, and nerd. This show brings you science and learning through conversations with stellar people from different fields. Put on your spacesuits and hold tight. Our voyage into the learner's universe begins now. Okay, so welcome to another episode of the Learning Cosmos podcast, everyone. And I am very happy to have Evelina Fedorenko with me today. So thank you so much for saying yes to this podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, let me start by asking not a tough question, an easy one, but I think very important to the listeners of this show. So how many languages do you speak, Evelina?
Well, at this point, it's really one and a half. I mean, I'm a heritage speaker of Russian. I don't really use it, haven't used it for many years, but I can still understand things and I can say things okay, but it's harder. And I used to speak French quite fluently, and
Oh,
I knew some German and Polish and a little bit of Spanish, but living in the US is hard to
yeah.
maintain language competence. And so, mostly but it's still helpful to have learned them, to have some sense of like different linguistic structures and how languages convey meanings.
Absolutely. Yeah. I feel the same because now I'm a Brazilian teacher of English and I
Uh,
have university, college students, and I think
yeah,
it's much easier for me to help them knowing that I
yes,
have learned languages myself, English
that's
being the
right.
second language that I learned, and my dad was Swedish and I learned a little bit of Swedish, but
Oh,
again,
yeah,
I
yeah,
haven't used it in so many years that I don't think I can remember much. Yeah.
that's right. That's right. They fall asleep, languages do. Yeah.
Exactly. And tell me a little bit about the research that you do about languages. So, am I correct to describe you as a cognitive linguist or neuro linguist
A
or something like
language
that?
scientist.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I mean, I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I'm focusing primarily on language, but language is such a thing that it connects to almost everything else that we do, right? Like the
Yeah.
language system has to interface with our perceptual and motor systems, with our systems of knowing about the world and remembering our past and imagining the future. Like we use language as this very flexible tool that seamlessly interfaces with all these other things that our brain can do. And so by virtue of studying language, you often end up studying things that are adjacent to
Yeah.
language. And in our case, a big part of what we do was actually ending up figuring out which things is language distinct from and which things is it overlapping with, right? Because language has features that are similar to many other things. And so we've tested a bunch of possibilities for how language relates to other things, and can
That's
talk more
amazing.
about that.
Yeah. And am I correct to assume that there has been some kind of sort of, revolution, let's say, because of neuroimaging studies, right? So I think for decades
Yeah,
we were not really able to test anything looking inside the brain, and nowadays you have access to those tools. So
that's right.
yeah.
That's right. I mean, to be fair, like for a long, long time before neuroimaging became available, we could make inferences based on dissociations that we see in patients with brain damage, right? So that's a very
Yeah.
kind of coarse um, version of brain imaging, because if you have two individuals with different kinds of brain damage and one of them can do math but can't really do language, and another one can do language and can't really do math, that suggests that there's some separability between those things in the
Yeah.
brain, right? Because otherwise you shouldn't be able to damage one without damaging the other. So these kinds of patients have been hugely informative in the early days of cognitive science, and in kind of putting some constraints on things that may be distinct in the mind. But of course, neuroimaging is much easier and much more powerful in some ways because you can non-invasively measure responses to any task. Now, many groups have access to these studies, so it allows for, replicability, right? Like somebody
Yeah.
may find something I find interesting, I go and try to replicate it and build on it, things like that. So yeah, neuroimaging definitely opened a lot of doors to studying the structure of the mind.
Yes, and if I'm not mistaken, I think you've been using fMRI a lot, right? Or in
Yeah, that's
other types of techniques as well?
Yeah, I mean, we use all sorts of techniques. I mean, for different questions, different modalities of imaging are helpful, right? So fMRI is really good at spatial resolution, so
Yeah,
figuring out if two pieces of tissue support distinct functions, right? So for these questions, like questions about the structure of the mind, you need a method like that that has high spatial resolution. If you're really interested in the exact time course of when some computation happens in the brain, like how quickly do you recognize a face? Well, fMRI is not very good for that because it doesn't
yeah,
have that ability to measure things quickly. And so then you turn to, either intracranial recordings or
yeah,
EEG in some cases, or yeah. So
yeah.
the method should be defined by the question you want to ask.
Exactly. And I believe the question you've been asking lately has been something related to the idea of language and thought and how connected they are. Because, going back to, the early 40s and 50s, I think, we had Sapir-Whorf, right? And we
Mm,
had the idea that language determines thought. So you cannot think things that are not part of your language and so on. So
yeah.
what do we know now based on the research that you've been doing?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you brought up Sapir-Whorf. I mean, that's one kind of class of hypotheses about how language influences thought. There also are other hypotheses in that space. So, for example, some people have taken the structure of language to somehow suggest that it's language that enabled us to think
Yeah,
certain kinds of thoughts, like, for example, structured logical thoughts, right? So humans are very logical. They can do math, they can do formal logical reasoning, they can do relational reasoning, analogical reasoning. And quite a few people have argued that language was a key piece that allowed for that to happen. And of course, in terms of evolution, there's no way to find out exactly how these different abilities came into place. But in terms of asking about the relationship between language and these various capacities. We now know that in terms of implementation, it's different parts of your brain that process
wow,
language compared to kind of do different kinds of thinking, right? And it's
yeah,
not like thinking is one undifferentiated bucket. There's also
yeah,
different kinds of thinking that we can do. And it turns out that, for example, we have a specialized system for thinking about other people's thoughts, right? Like, what am I thinking that Andre believes about
yeah,
X, right? Like this kind of thing. And then there's a separate system that supports our simulation of the physical world and being able to predict, like, will a ball fall off when it comes to the end of the table, right? Will it go down or will it stay hovering in the air, right?
yeah,
And then there is also a system that appears to support kind of general problem solving. So for problems where you don't have a specialized system, what do? Well, we have a system that for any kind of new problem, it will allow you to figure out how to approach it and things like that. So and
yeah,
that's not the only things. I'm just mentioning a few, but so there's different kinds of thinking that we and others have discovered, and the language system seems to be really non-overlapping with any of those
wow,
things. This is not to say that they don't work together. Of course they do. They
sure,
must, right? Because the by virtue of its function, language serves as a medium for taking some abstract representation, some thought, and
yeah,
converting it into word sequence. That's how we communicate with each other, right? That's this process back and forth.
absolutely,
And then when I hear you say, you talk, I take your word sequence and I try to extract some high level meaning that you must have wanted to express, and so on. And so of course, there's a lot of interaction between these systems, but critically, there is sharp separation between these systems and how they interact. There's a lot of ongoing research trying to
wow.
understand how these systems talk to each other, but they're not one and the same. So it's not like you use your language system to do math or to reason about somebody else's thoughts.
Yeah,
So
that's
that's kind of
that's incredible because that reminded me of an episode of Cosmos. Learning Cosmos was partly inspired by Cosmos by Carl Sagan, and he
Mhm.
said something about what an amazing thing a book is because you can read the thoughts of somebody who might have been
Exactly,
dead for thousands of years, and you can
exactly
learn
right.
those theories, those mathematical theories and formulae and everything. But
That's
you
right.
you were telling us that you don't need to activate those language regions in the brain when you're solving a math equation necessarily, right? So those are
That's
separate in the
exactly right.
brain.
That's
Yeah,
exactly right. So it's one thing to learn through language, and of course, this is how language has transformed our society over the last, many, many thousands of years, right? Is
exactly.
language allows to transmit knowledge, and that's exactly, I think, what Sagan meant, right?
Yeah,
Um, I can write something down, and this piece of knowledge is preserved, or I can tell it. It does even before the writing systems came about, right? People would
yeah.
tell each other knowledge over generations, like how to grow certain fruits or how to build a boat or whatever
And
useful
that
knowledge you
was the oral
gain.
tradition, right? We told stories
Exactly.
and we kept language
Exactly.
alive. Yeah,
Yes, yes, yes. And knowledge, not just language, critically the
yeah,
information that the language can. And in fact, there's really, interesting work right now about how some languages that are dying out may have
yeah.
some unique knowledge about the world, like certain medicinal properties of herbs that only grow in, some
Oh
small part of
yeah.
Australia or something like that. And you lose that knowledge because there's just nobody else that can talk about it, right? Because
Oh
speakers
yeah,
of that language are dying out and there's no bilingual speakers or something like that. But anyway, so yes, we learn through language. We learn most of what we know through language, but the actual computations that are necessary to solve a math problem or to plan how I'm going to solve this complex puzzle
yeah.
or remember my past, that seems to not rely on linguistic representations.
Yeah, and how do you get to a conclusion like that? Looking at neuroimaging studies, so do you have subjects, do something that involves language and something that doesn't involve language, like maths, and then
Exactly.
you
Yeah,
check for different
that's
patterns of
exactly right.
activation and something like
It's
that?
really, it's not even just different patterns, but yeah, I mean, so
Yeah,
so it's different locations of activations, right? So
yeah,
you have tasks that isolate some linguistic processing and some non-linguistic processing, like mathematical problems, right? And you can imagine having harder problems and easier problems, whatever, right?
yeah,
So you can find parts of your brain that are engaged when you have to do more of that computation, right? When you have to like add more bigger numbers together compared to doing something simpler with smaller numbers or something like that. And so that's exactly right. So the burden is on the experimentalist to come up with paradigms that isolate those putative processes of interest, and then you can try to see whether you have overlap. And in
yeah.
many cases, people have found that some functions show strong overlap. It's not like whatever you find, you always find dissociations, right? There's many, many cases where like different kinds of math engage overlapping circuits. Different demanding tasks. So there's many tasks that people often describe as executive function tasks,
Yep.
like working memory tasks and kind of cognitive control, inhibition tasks. And all of
Perfect.
those seem to engage the same kind of extensive system in the brain. But this general approach is really good at figuring out kind of the ontology of the
Yeah.
mind, right? Which pieces reliably separate such that different bits of the brain are active when you're engaging in those processes and which ones tap the same resource. So
Wow,
activating the same
that's
brain.
very interesting. I remember now when I was a student at the University of Bristol, and we had a unit about language acquisition and language learning in the brain and things like that. I remember we read something by Lera Boroditsky about
Mm-hmm.
how language influences your perception of the world and something like that. So, what's your take on that? So that's the let's say the light version of Sapir-Whorf, I guess. So depending on the
Yeah, I mean, it's
language you
not, yeah.
speak, yeah, you,
Mhm.
you might have a different perception of certain things and certain objects because of the gender that goes with them or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, so there is there's I don't think even it's a light version of that. I think it's basically trying to test predictions from Sapir and Whorf. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, many findings that have come out from that body of work are not robust and replicable findings. So
Yeah.
people find them really exciting, and a lot of groups try to replicate them, and they don't seem to be robust to replication, which suggests that, the initial studies were flukes and not real findings, exciting as it would be to find such things. But there are some studies within that tradition that seem to be real things, but they have, to the extent that I think they are real findings, they can be explained in other ways. You don't
Yeah.
need to postulate this effect of a particular language on how you perceive the world. So, for example, yeah, well, maybe I'll leave it at that. I mean, I'm
Yeah,
happy to
yeah,
elaborate.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's great. I always thought, I don't know if I'm right to say this, but I always thought it's much more about culture and habit formation. And, if something matters to that specific culture, it doesn't really have to do with language. And then, of course, you create
exactly.
language to talk about that, right? So, but
That's
if
exactly right. You're
that's,
absolutely right about this. That's the
yeah,
direction that makes sense. Something is important to
yeah,
a society, and we're social creatures, and we use language to communicate. So we're like, oh, let's come up with a word for this, right? A computer
yeah,
became a widespread thing, so we came up with a word to refer to it, right? So I think that directionality makes so much sense, that people, invent words for things that come into the culture sometimes, and you need to talk about it. So of course you're going to have a lot of words for snow if you have to describe these different conditions,
exactly.
right? And they vary in a subtle way. But it's not like because you had words you see the world differently. It's you have those words because you have a cultural need to talk about these distinctions that to someone else just don't make sense. They're like, oh yeah, it's all snow,
Absolutely.
cold, right? So
Yeah,
it
so I
needs to
think
be.
it's the other way around. And I remember maybe I watched a video or I read a paper that you wrote about even patients with aphasia, because when you have global aphasia, or maybe it was Broca's aphasia, or I don't remember exactly which type, you lose language skills, either about speech production or language comprehension, but you can still think mathematically, apparently, right? So can you
Right.
tell us a little bit about that? That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, so that's this older approach that, works really nicely in conjunction with imaging, because it's great if they provide convergent evidence. And so indeed, it's the case that sometimes people with even severe forms of aphasia where they can't produce or understand language, they appear to be able to be just as smart and think all the same thoughts as before, as measured
wow.
by various tests of thinking. And in fact, aphasiologists, so people who work with patients with aphasia trying to, improve their quality of life, have long had this slogan, which is something like, aphasia is not loss of intelligence.
Yeah,
And the reason that that's a really important message is because we often judge people by how they talk, right? Like if somebody
that
talks
is true. Yeah,
fluently and expresses complex ideas, you're like, oh, they're really smart. And if somebody stutters or has a strong accent, they're often judged as, not as bright or not as talented or whatever. And of course, patients with aphasia have an extreme form of difficulty in communicating, and so they're often assumed to be, mentally not fully there. But in many cases, of course, there are also cases where language and other things are affected, but there are cases of these patients who just lose this medium of connecting to others through language, but
yeah.
the thoughts are there. And if they were doing Sudoku puzzles before, they can still do them. If they play chess before, they can still do it. And if they composed music before, they can still do it. So a lot of the mental richness is still there. You just lose this interface that allows you to connect to other people.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating, and now I'm wondering. Again, I read The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker, and
Mm,
he was the one who proposed this language of the brain. He called mentalese that would be translated into whatever language that we learned. So, does that
yeah.
have anything to do with that? Because it's just a theory that we have a language of the brain that
That's right.
processes things and then needs to be translated into whatever language we speak in that culture. So, what do you think about that?
That's right. Well, so that's there is a lot of things we don't understand. So now you're asking about the format of thoughts, right? Like what is
Yeah,
the
yeah,
code in which we think, right? Such that we have those
exactly.
thoughts and we can translate them into words. Well, there's a lot of people trying to figure that out. And remember how I mentioned that there is several different systems that seem to be dissociable, like a system for
Yep.
social reasoning, a system for physical reasoning, whether those different systems of thought have different kinds of codes, or whether it's
Uh-huh.
just the same type of computation that just deals with
Like
different
binary code or
concepts.
something like that.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And so, there is this hypothesis that's due to Jerry Fodor, originally, but even before him, people had similar notions, this notion of the language of thought, right? And so
Yeah.
that's what Pinker is referring to as mentalese. Now, there are some people who have gone further than that, and perhaps the label confused them or something, that said, well, the language of thought is language, natural language.
Yeah.
But so that story turns out to not be right. But what the format of the language of thought is a big open question. There is a very popular notion these days that finds support in many domains of cognition, that it's basically something like computer code.
Okay.
It's pieces of computer programs which can be used to process information about the world, to store certain frequently encountered patterns or frequent ways in which we may need to solve a problem. In computer coding, it's called memorization, right? So you store certain
Yeah.
routines. And so one possibility is that the systems of thought in humans basically in some way implement something like this. Of
Uh-huh.
course, how those kinds of representations are implemented in wet tissue, right, in a bunch of cells,
Yeah.
still, we don't understand, we as a field don't understand yet, but there's a lot of people trying to work on that. It's
Yeah.
a big.
Wow, that's such fascinating topic. I mean, I think because I remember also was it Wittgenstein or who said that the
Mm-hmm.
limits of the world, the limits of my
Limits of
thought
the
or the
language,
language are the
the
limits
language or
of my
limits of my
world, right?
thought. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I keep telling my students that, learning different languages will open up this entire, other, like a parallel universe. I tell
That's
them that you can
right.
learn so much. But
Yeah.
now, after listening to you, it's not as simple, right? I think a lot of
That's
people,
right.
yeah, it's
That's
much more
yeah.
complex than I had thought. And
Yeah.
what can you tell us about your specific research today? What is moving you
Yeah.
today in terms of, investigation? And please tell
Yeah.
us
I
a
mean,
little bit more.
I
Yeah,
can say a few words about that, but just to build on what you said, I mean, it is absolutely and undeniably true that learning a language exposes you to kind of a whole new lens into the
yeah,
world. But I think the reason for that is likely because when learning a language, you're also learning about the culture, because language will reflect culture, right? And so
absolutely.
you're learning like, wow, this language has a word for, this particular concept, or this language doesn't have words for exact numbers. Like, how interesting is this, right? It means that in their culture, those concepts are just not that useful or important, right? So it's
Yeah,
absolutely true that by learning languages, you learn a huge amount about a culture. It's not the case that by learning a particular code, you can learn to think new things. So you learn new things about the world by
that's
learning about
true.
other cultures. But
Yeah, and
anyways, in terms,
just
yeah.
before you go on, I just wanted to add that Professor Daniel Everett, who came to
Yeah, I
Brazil,
know Daniel.
I'm
Yeah.
Brazilian, I'm based in Brazil. He studied
Uh-huh.
a community, an indigenous
Uh-huh.
community, the Pirahan, right?
That's right.
And they
I
have
met
a
some of
very
those
sim.
teachers.
Yeah, you've probably
Yeah.
studied that, right? So much more than me. But I remember that the language is quite simple, and they don't have numerals or something
Right.
like that. So
They don't have words for exact numbers, right? They have
it,
words which are for relative quantities. That's
like
exactly right.
one and two and
Or
many or something like that,
it's not
right?
even that. So that's what Dan
Yeah,
thought, and that's what many people think, that
yeah.
languages that have like simple numerical systems. But when we went down, so I didn't go down, but I was involved in the collaboration that studied this group. A
Oh,
very simple
okay.
experiment showed that it's actually not one, two, and many, because you do a simple experiment, right? You
Yeah,
take objects that are all the same, like, beads, right?
yeah,
Many different beads. And the way that you typically elicit, you learn about the numerical systems in a language is you put one bead down and you say, what's that, right? And they say, huan, right? Which
yeah,
is, what Dan thought was a word for one. And then you put
yeah,
another bead and you say, what's this? And they'll say a different word, huan. it actually like a tone goes down or something, or one or the other. Anyway, and so
Okay.
they say a different word. And then you put three and they'll say bagisu, which is a word for many in
Okay.
Piraha, or what Den thought. And then
Yeah.
you put four and they're like bagisu, and put another one, bagisu. And then
So
they're
that's
like,
the
what are
limit.
we doing here? Right? Right.
Yeah.
But then, so Mike Frank and Ted Gibson, who were doing these experiments with the Piraha, they somewhat accidentally, for one participant, they started at 10. So they said, what's that? And they said bagisu. And then they
Yeah.
took one away and they said bagisu. And then by the time they got to 6, they started using the word for, which Dan and
Yeah.
others thought was a word for 2. Well, it's
Okay.
clearly not a word for 2. It's a word for fewer relative to some context, right? There
Uh-huh.
was
Yeah.
a lot and now there is less. And oftentimes, like by the time you get to, 5 or 4, people would start using a word that people used to think means 1, which clearly doesn't, right? It
Uh-huh.
means something
Yeah.
like the smallest quantity. Anyways, so it turns out that they actually really don't have any words that denote exact quantities. So it's
Yeah.
all relative to context. And, people speculate that the reason some cultures don't have words for exact quantities is that they don't do farming,
Yeah.
because when you need to start keeping track of the same items of the same kind is when you start having lots of cow or whatever, right? So
Exactly.
and until you do that, it's just not that critical to their culture, and they get by
Yeah.
with these relative numbers.
And just another example popped into my head now. It was the Dani people, I think, from Indonesia, maybe, or there was one of the
Mm-hmm.
archipelagos, and they had two words for color. I think it was mili and mola or something like that. But it was
Uh-huh.
not that they couldn't learn. So basically, it was green and blue was the same word, and so cold colors were the same word or something like. But they could see the difference. They could learn the difference when the
Of
researchers
course,
came down there.
perceptually, yes, yes,
Exactly.
yes. Yeah, yeah. So sometimes people get confused, like, oh, because you don't have words for all these things, you can't make those distinctions. And that's just completely misguided. We have the visual system that we have. It's adapted to see the world that we're surrounded by. And of
Yeah.
course, you can make those distinctions. It's just not useful to label things. And in fact, so Ted Gibson, who I mentioned, has done a lot of follow-up work on the color words as well. And it seems like a lot of color words start to come into the language when you start having artifacts. Because
Yeah.
when are color terms useful? When you need to distinguish two things that just differ in color, right? And in the
Yeah.
natural world, that just doesn't often happen, because oftentimes things
True.
that differ in color only also differ in other things, right? Like a green banana and a yellow banana also differ in ripeness, right? And we already have a word for that, and so on. And so it's really when you have, clothes or other artifacts that just differ in the color that people start introducing color labels into the language. But so it's a super fun
Absolutely. Yeah.
topic.
Well, I sorry I interrupted you when you started talking
Yeah,
about
that's
your current research because
great.
this is such a fascinating topic. But please go
Yeah.
on.
Yes, sure. So, well, so there's a lot of questions that I think are still very much big open questions. One has to do with trying to continue understanding what types of thought are distinct from one another. So this is
Yeah.
like the ontology of thinking. And I actually have a student who just got her PhD, Hope Keen, who just discovered a new system, which I didn't think was possible anymore. She
Whoa.
discovered a system that
Yeah.
appears to support abstract logical inference, so formal logical thinking. Um,
Okay.
and until she started doing this work, I would have bet money that it's basically the same system that I mentioned that we use to solve new problems,
Sure.
because a lot
Yeah.
of things like mathematical reasoning seem to load on that system. But it turns out that with logical reasoning, you engage a separate set of brain regions, and they're totally separate from this very general problem-solving system. Anyway, so I think there's a lot to do yet in trying to understand which kinds of thinking are distinct and why, right? Like, what are the
Yeah.
distinct demands on those forms of thinking so that it's helpful somehow evolutionarily to have them be supported by distinct systems, right? And some of those questions can actually be potentially informed by looking at modern computational
Yeah.
models to ask which kinds of things may separate within those models, because there's these, really cool discoveries from AI models where, for
Yeah.
example, you know how in the human brain we have specialized machinery for processing faces, right? So you have
Yeah.
parts of your visual cortex that just do faces. Now, the story for that has long been that it's evolutionary pressures because conspecifics are really important. So you definitely want to have some way to recognize them. Well, it
Yeah.
turns out that on models that have no impetus for survival and no biological pressures as such,
Yeah.
face processing and object processing naturally segregate just by virtue of training on
Oh,
natural
look at
image
that.
statistics. So
Yeah.
something about the demands associated with processing faces versus other objects are distinct enough so that there is this natural segregation that happens even without building in any kind of biological pressures to, find your
Yeah.
group like that. Anyway, and we're trying to maybe use models in similar ways to ask these kinds of questions, like does uh, do different kinds of thinking separate from language naturally over time and over training, and do different kinds of thinking separate from one another? And so it's one bucket is trying to understand how thinking works.
Yeah.
Another big bucket has to do with language development, language learning, right? Like
Okay.
where does language come from? How does it emerge? When does it emerge? How does it affect other things when it emerges? And I have a postdoc, Haley Olson, who is working on these questions. So we're trying to basically understand. Okay, so language, the language system, the way that we define it, it's a system that helps you interpret and encode thoughts into word sequences and interpret word sequences that others produce. Now, of
Yeah.
course, you do not have this ability at birth. You're not born knowing a language. And in fact,
True.
depending on which community you're born to, you will learn the language of that community, right? Because language is a learned
Yeah.
thing. But you can ask a very interesting question, such as, by about age 4 or 5, you will now have regions in your brain that specialize for processing linguistic information, okay, for
Yeah.
both encoding and decoding. And you can go back in time, so to speak, and say, what are these regions doing before they become responsive to language? What are they
Uh-huh.
responding to? Are
Yeah.
they responding to social signals like faces or tone of voice or something like this? Are
Yeah.
they responding to any kind of structured sequences in the world? Are they responding to meaningful information, like
Yeah.
meaningful events that we can see through vision? And to do this, it's not an easy feat, right? You have to
Sure.
do longitudinal testing of an infant brain exposed to all sorts of stimuli that have these different features, and then subsequently testing them when they have their language regions in place and doing this kind of backwards analysis of what are the responses in infancy of these
Wow.
regions that become specialized for language. And that can kind of tell you a little bit like, what are these circuits made of? What are language circuits made of? So it's like a, hard, big
Yeah.
question that I'm hoping we'll maybe get some traction on.
Yeah,
Um,
and that
yeah.
reminded me, just to add something. Patricia Cole did a very interesting study on a phonological window, so to speak, So if you're not
Mhm.
exposed to certain sounds by the age of, I think, 12 months or something like that, then you start losing the ability to recognize and
Distinguish
pronounce,
them.
later in life,
Yeah.
those sounds. And I feel like I am struggling. I think I told you that I'm going to China, and I'm a
Yeah.
39-year-old man, and I know a lot
Mhm.
of other languages, but this has been the most difficult language that I've been
Because of
learning for
tones.
2 months now, and it's so difficult
Yeah.
because of the tones. And I feel
Yeah.
like exactly
It's
what Patricia
hard.
said, because I wasn't exposed to those sounds when I was growing up, and now for me to actually be able to reproduce them, it takes a lot of effort, and
That's right. That's
yeah.
absolutely right. I mean, in a similar way, there's even so actually when a baby is born, a baby will be as interested in macaque vocalizations as it
Oh,
is in speech. So there's
wow.
a period of a few weeks where all of those sounds are really exciting to a baby and they're paying attention. And then
Yeah.
presumably through experience, they notice that speech is what comes out of the mouths of those around them, and then
Yeah.
they kind of become, start finding speech more interesting, and then eventually they lose the discriminability of sounds that are not in phonological alternation in their language, right? But
Yeah.
yeah, I think there is all sorts of interesting questions about how language is learned and how this, potential loss of certain distinctions that don't matter help you zero in on the relevant features, and then you can bootstrap
Absolutely.
the whole system and whatever. So I think there's a lot of interesting questions there.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. And then, I mean, we're also trying to understand things that language has typically been studied in isolation from, like things that go along with language in many cases, like
Yep.
prosody, right? The tone of voice,
Oh, yeah.
or facial expressions or gestures, right? In
Yeah.
our typical human to human interaction, face to face interaction, there's all these different cues that we use, and we can use information from these non-linguistic channels of information to potentially interpret things in quite different ways, right? Like if you say something
Absolutely.
with a smile versus with an eye roll, like
Yeah.
those can have very different intended meanings.
Yeah.
And so there's now increasing interest in the field in trying to understand this, people kind of multimodal communication. Like, it seems that so one simple hypothesis is maybe anything communicatively relevant is processed by the same mechanisms. So
Yeah.
that's not the case. So brain regions that process facial expressions, brain regions that process gestural information appear to be separate from language. It's not like anything communicative is just all goes through one route, but how these different channels connect to create this integrated percept, right, of
Yeah.
communicating conspecific. I think there's a lot of things that we don't understand yet about
Wow,
how that
yeah.
happens.
And
Um,
so I could ask you then, because I've been using ChatGPT or other AIs to practice
yeah.
Chinese because sadly I don't have anyone to practice with. I'm going to China
Yeah.
next week and that's going to change. And
Mm-hmm.
it feels like, and I think you talked about that in a different talk. It feels like LLMs are actually thinking, or at least they pretend very well that they're thinking. They
That's right.
hallucinate
That's right.
sometimes,
Yeah,
but it's interesting practice for those of us who
for
have no
sure.
other way to practice. But then
Absolutely.
we're missing those cues, body language and facial
Yeah.
expression. So how do you feel about the future of language teaching? And because just to give you more context, a
Yeah.
lot of people are betting on the metaverse and avatars, as teachers instead of
Yeah.
actually going to a real face-to-face classroom because they say that's going to speed up the
Yeah.
process. But so, do you have anything to
It's an
say about
important
that?
question.
Yeah,
I mean, I think it's an empirical question about how well you can do language teaching with avatars. I don't see any reason in principle that you couldn't, because you can
yeah,
also, like, AI is getting very sophisticated. So you can integrate things like gesture and prosody. And in fact, already there's auditory models that really do pretty good at
yeah.
capturing patterns of like
True.
intonation and so on. So, and for for all it's worth, like we've done some work studying polyglots, right? Individuals who study many, many
Uh-huh.
different languages. And some of them learn almost like purely from books. I mean, eventually they like learn how things sound, but you can learn a lot about a language with no even exposure to the auditory input. Or you can learn from just the auditory input. So I know somebody who's learned a lot of languages by listening to radio in foreign language
Oh,
without knowing anything, just picking up on things and, eventually starting to recognize it. So you can learn a ton through different channels. Now, whether learning from a human versus learning from an avatar will lead to the same outcomes is an empirical
yeah,
question, and it's not obvious, right? Like it's, to me, it's not obvious. And of course,
yeah,
you would want to set up experiments that are really well controlled for everything except for the, humanness versus the artificialness of these teaching agents. But I think AI very likely can be helpful in many, many ways. It's a good tool. It should be used with a
definitely.
brain.
Yes.
I think sometimes when a new tool becomes available, people just kind of throw it at all sorts of problems without thinking through whether it has the underlying capabilities to actually do what you want it to do. But, with enough careful thinking, I think it can be really helpful in many ways, including in language teaching. And you're already doing it in your
Yeah, but
work.
but the thing about ChatGPT is that it's too kind to me, So it keeps telling me, "Well done, Han Hao, Fei Cheng Hao," like I know that I
Yeah.
mispronounced the tone, and I tell ChatGPT, okay, you can be a little hard or harsher on me because I think that's going to help me learn. But
You
yeah,
want a
it's
strict teacher.
well, a little stricter, maybe,
Yeah,
just to make sure that I'm getting those tones right. I don't want to say
I got
anything
you.
stupid in China, but that's
Yeah,
inevitable, I
yeah.
think. But
Well, you probably will, and it's okay.
it's
People, like
okay.
most people, when somebody comes
Absolutely.
and tries to speak their language, except for maybe, French people in Paris, like that
Yeah.
makes them feel
Yes.
very warm and appreciative that you're trying to learn about their culture and their language, and so that they'll help as opposed to, mock you or
I
whatever.
couldn't agree
Like,
more. It's funny that every time I've watched tutorials and lessons, Chinese, Mandarin, and
yeah.
every time people pretend they don't speak Chinese and then they go and say something in Chinese, everybody's so happy that you're making
Yes,
the
for
effort.
sure.
So it's going to be
Exactly.
an interesting experience. But then
Yeah.
moving towards the end of this lovely conversation, I wanted to focus on so can LLMs ever become, I don't know. So we're talking about, I don't want to say conscious because that's not what I'm thinking, but they
Yeah.
don't think. It's just a probabilistic machine, right? Just looking. So can you tell us about the future of LLMs according to the research you've done?
I mean, we're also probabilistic machines, I think. But
Yeah, we
anyway,
are too, right?
yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Can we also make errors? But I mean, so
Yeah.
it's a very hard question. So I'm not myself an engineer, so I don't work in AI directly. I only work in AI, in the service of trying to evaluate AI models as
Yeah.
models of some aspects of human processing. But there's certainly things we learned about the human brain that's very different from current AI systems, right? And there's many, many, many
Yeah.
such things, right? From the fact that uh, the human brain appears to be quite modular in its architecture compared to LLMs that are mostly these, complex systems where everything is within this one big neural net. Although there is interesting work suggesting that some modularity may emerge in these models over the course of
Oh,
training, but that's, it's not built in most models. But there's also many, many things that are different from the fact that humans learn from much less data. Human brains have wiring cost lengths, so long connections are costly, right? It takes, and neural nets, many of them are kind of fully interconnected
yeah.
sets of units, and memory is very different, right? Current LLMs keep track of these very, very long contexts. As opposed to humans, where at least in terms of linguistic information, we very quickly discard the information and only keep the meaning around. And
Yeah.
so there's all these differences, and it's not a crazy question to ask. That in spite of these differences, can you build intelligence in
Yeah.
this very different way,
Yeah.
right? And that's a perfectly reasonable goal, modulo these concerns like environmental concerns and everything else. But there's alternative strategies, right? You can also take insights from the human brain and try to build models that
Exactly.
are more like the human brain, and then see whether some such models do better at different tasks. And indeed, there is, quite a lot of work. Many groups are working on trying to build these what people call, either hybrid neurosymbolic models, where you basically take like a
Yep.
language, a small LLM, and connect it to something like a symbolic problem solver or a pragmatic reasoner or a
Wow.
physics
Yeah.
physics engine kind of
Yeah.
thing. And then those models tend to do much better and are much more robust. But of course, the challenge with those models is that they will be restricted to particular kinds of problems that they solve, right?
Yeah.
So something like a language system hooked up to a symbolic problem solver will only solve those kinds of problems. Like it can't do
Exactly.
physical reasoning, it doesn't. But then there's also these models called the mixture of experts models, where you try to
Uh-huh.
put a bunch of these different modules, each of them specialized for a particular thing, right? There's division of
Oh, I
labor,
didn't know about
and then
that.
you put them
Okay.
up the language system. Yeah. And so you build these more
Yeah.
modular AI systems, and some of those models are, showing great successes in some things. And so I think it's really cool that for the first time in the history of humankind, we can ask these questions like, is there more than one way to
Yes.
build intelligence, right? And we
Yeah.
can test these possible ways against each other. um if I were to bet money on this, I would probably bet against at least like controlling for the amount of energy taken by a biological system versus an artificial
Sure.
system.
Yeah.
I think it would be really hard to get to human level of robustness in cognition with the current dominant paradigm, which is just, has been like scaling models, making them bigger, training them on more data, and so the amount of energy spent is
Yeah.
growing big. The gap is growing bigger and bigger
Yeah.
between humans, these AI systems. So I think figuring out how to compress things and make them more efficient, which I think, division of labor is a very useful concept. And so
Absolutely. Yeah.
I
I
think such kind
remember, yeah, I have a book by Stanislas Dehaene, the French
of, mhm,
neuroscientist, who said something about how evolution played a part there, because in attention is so important, because we can right away select what matters, and
exactly,
LLMs are
relevant
trained with big
information.
data, and then it has to go through everything, for hours and hours, and it spends a lot of energy, right? So it's
That's right.
interesting
That's right.
to
Yeah.
think, because a lot of people are under the impression that AI is much more intelligent than us. And I talk to my
Yeah.
students, and I tell them, you have to do the work yourself. You have to
That's
apply,
right.
cognitive effort. Otherwise, you won't learn. But AI can do it
That's right.
easier for
No,
me,
that's
right?
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, like I think again, like some people like there is a lot of utility in having LLMs. Like, for
Yeah.
example, just like there's utility in having books, right? Like you were talking
Exactly.
about how books are a really great way to pass knowledge across generations. LLMs are effectively, they have the mass of human knowledge in one system. That's a
Yeah.
really powerful tool. There's nothing like that.
Yes.
And in some sense, they are smarter because the information is there.
Yeah.
Now, whether they can do all the right things with that information is a whole separate question.
Yeah.
But I think actually a smart human can potentially use that somehow to even make new discoveries about, how certain things work in the world. Because a lot
Good.
of big discoveries happen by analogy, right? Like you have some knowledge from some field, and then you're working in a different field, and you're like, wow, I see this parallel, like a structure of an atom is maybe the same as a structure of, solar system or something like that, right? You
Exactly.
see
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
observation, and for that, it's really great to have access to bits and pieces of information from about everything. And so
Yes.
I think figuring out ways to help LLMs, to use LLMs in the way to help us think, to help us find structure that we may not find if we have the kind of narrow specialization as we have on humans, right? Because right
Yeah.
now we're highly, narrow specialists in all fields, right? From
That's true.
different aspects of engineering to different aspects of chemistry to different, we're very, very narrowly specialized. And so I think we need to have some balance in appreciating LLMs for what they can give us, but also not anthropomorphizing them too much and not
Yes.
assigning to
Yeah.
them capabilities that they may not have.
Yeah.
Um,
I could see you're much
yeah.
more optimistic than I am. I think I read too many dystopian novels, This,
Doom.
yes.
I grew up in the Soviet Union. I had to be optimistic to survive.
Yes, absolutely. And to wrap up, I just wanted to ask you a question about, so LLMs are definitely an interesting tool. I think if we teach our students how to use them well, it can
Mhm.
potentialize, their learning for sure. But at the same time, I feel like that it's kind of like a cost relationship there, because I feel that students are not reading as much as they used to. I mean, there some figures came out last year here in Brazil that most of the population doesn't read anything, novels or literary books or anything like that. And isn't that also important for brain, for cognitive thinking, for language learning, for all? So are you concerned with that at all, that people are maybe delegating
I mean,
there's a name for that,
yeah,
cognitive offloading, right? So you're offloading
that's
a
right.
bunch of
That's
things
right.
to LLMs and not reading. And does that concern you at all?
It's a great question. I mean, I mean, there's differences in not reading novels and not reading because a
Yeah.
lot of interactions with LM still require language and give you language experience, right? But you're right that it's potentially a very different training history now that we're getting for humans, right?
Yeah.
Instead of a lot of it is different kinds of reading to this system that can get you information very quickly, and help you fulfill your goals, but may be so fun to interact with that you forego, for example, reading novels. And it's, again, it's an empirical question of what that does to the brain. There is apparently recent evidence that so there's been this effect that I'm sure you've heard of called the Flynn effect, where the
Oh,
IQ has
yes.
been going up and
IQ.
up and
Yeah.
up in
Yeah.
humans, and it seems to have reached a plateau and maybe is going down, which
Yeah.
some people are linking to cognitive offloading. But I think, directly linking it to this is very hard because there's many, many things that are changing in the world, and which
Uh-huh.
exact features of the changing world lead to that, I think is hard to decide without doing proper experiments where you take, two
Yeah.
groups of students, and then for some extended time, some of them are encouraged to read, and figuring out what do you test them on, right? Like, what do you test for? This reminds me a little bit, I'll just briefly tell a story of Daphne Bavalier's work, where she started studying people who play computer games, because at
Okay.
some point there was a lot of talk about how computer games are going to ruin people's brains and
Yeah.
destroy kids who are not going to read novels, they're going to play computer games all day long and whatever. And she started by testing their various executive abilities, like working memory and visual search and whatever. And everything she's tested things kids on, people who play video games, they were better.
Oh, look at
Okay.
that. Yeah.
Over and over and over was, okay, no, they're actually better. No, they're actually better in this. No, they're actually better in this. And so
Yeah.
I think, I share the intuition that there's something is lost. Like, if people are not reading Shakespeare, not, engaging with kind of the classics of the literature that kind of reflect the cumulative culture of the world as, it went through these generations of change, that we're losing something. But how to exactly quantify it and how to test which changes in the current environments are leading to loss, and how to measure that loss. Like, what are these kids going to be worse at? Are they
Yeah.
going to be worse at reasoning about others' minds? Are they going to be less creative in their use of language or in their thinking? Like, I think it's far from trivial to figure out the tools, like the measures that we would use to make these comparisons.
Absolutely. Wow,
That's
wonderful. And,
amazing.
and and my last question, I promise this is the last one because we were talking about reading. I wonder if you are a nerd slash geek like me, if that's what
Yeah,
drove you into, science.
I think
Because
so.
when I was, growing up, I used to watch things like Star Wars and the Matrix or whatever, and I feel
Yeah,
that there's so much richness in that universe, of that maybe I
yeah.
wanted to discover things on my own as well. Is that your case? Do you have a
Imaginary world.
specific
Yeah.
genre that you like?
I mean, I'm definitely a nerd. Like, I always liked school. I always studied, like, all the time I had. Instead of running outside, like, I would be studying in some form or other. I don't know if there's a particular genre. I mean, I liked I think part of it is also, like, I had a pretty hard life growing up, and so many different
Yeah.
kinds of escapism worked for me.
Yeah.
So books of different genres, just working hard on, figuring out math and whatever, doing math Olympiads, like, that's all forms of escapism from reality that can
Absolutely.
be quite challenging at times. So but yeah, definitely a nerd.
Okay,
I've
good.
been
Good to know. I think nerds are taking over the world, and they
most
should. They're smart people.
should,
Yes.
yeah, not in the US, but yeah. Not right
Yes.
now, but we'll see. Yep.
We'll see. Yes. Well, thank you
Yeah,
very much, Evelina. This has been a wonderful
Trey.
conversation.
Fun.
Well,
Yeah.
if where can people find you? Where are you based right now? I know you are still working
I'm
with
at MIT.
MIT, right? Exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, our website is evlab.mit.edu. It's very easy to find us. My last
Perfect.
name is not that common, so yeah,
So, and I will
happy
link
to.
everything below the description of this episode. And
Sounds
again,
great.
thank you very much for accepting my invitation. It was a wonderful talk.
My pleasure. That was fun. Yeah.
Yes,
Thanks, and
thank you. And
bye.
folks, thank you so much. Stay tuned for more episodes of the Learning Cosmos podcast.